Go ahead.
You want to use the podium?
No, you don't want to use it.
Not a podium.
Okay, folks, welcome again. Our last support group of the year, 2016. And so we're pleased tonight to have Mr. Mike Sugar and his team, St. Jude. Oh, you've heard of St. Jude Medical? St. Jude started by making artificial heart valves, which they still do a fine job of. And now Mike works in the Pacemaker and Defibrillator division of St. Jude. He's a biomedical engineer who graduated from Georgia Tech, a very bright guy, who we rely on a lot to help us interpretation of devices. He's in the implants of a lot of these devices. He's been working with St. Jude, what, 5 years?
10. Almost
And
10.
with us down here?
Oh, probably 7 or 8. Now.
7 or 8.
So, I was in Mississippi for a couple of years.
He's going to talk to us a little bit about, you know, we've always, a lot of patients ask us, why can't you just put a pacemaker in to fix my AFib? Or what's the use of a pacemaker, and how is a pacemaker and a defibrillator different? So he's going to go over some of those basic things, and he brought some nice little models we can play with after. If you want to see how one is actually done, we can let you put your hands on it and try to see all the troubles the implanting doctors have. So without further ado, Mr. Mike Sugar.
Thank you, Dr. McKinney. I appreciate it. And I thank you guys for coming today. It's I know it's you know, late night Tuesday or Wednesday night, and I appreciate you guys coming. So I have Nick Lonergan here with me. He also works for St. Jude. He's going to help out with some of our little heart models here and just kind of show you guys some of the techniques our doctors use to put in these devices. So we're going to save all the questions till the end. That's right, Sharon?
Yeah, you can have a Q&A.
We'll do a little Q&A in the end. So if you have any questions, you can write them down like during it, and then at the end you can ask, and we'll do our best to answer what we got. So today we're going to go over pacemakers and defibrillators, and then also how they help Dr. McKinney and Dr. Zhao with your atrial fibrillation and other arrhythmias as well. So just going to start out here. So we're going to go over pacemakers. We're going to go over how they're implanted. We're going to go over what they do, what a pacemaker is. We're going to go over what an ICD is, why you get an ICD is different than why you get a pacemaker sometimes. So we're going to go over those options, and then we're going to show you some implant with this little heart model we have here. Then we're going to go on our programmer, our St. Jude programmer over here. We're going to show you an actual interrogation. Who has a defibrillator or pacemaker in here? Is anyone? We got a couple. Excellent. Good. Thank you. So they're the experts. So if you have any questions, you can ask them. She says no. All right. But yeah, so we're going to go over that stuff, and then at the end, we're going to show you, after all this stuff, how that helps these doctors with your heart. So that's kind of what we're going to go over, and then we'll have a little question session at the end. So the first thing is, why do I need a pacemaker? What is it for? So pacemaker, so if you think about your heart, you can kind of break it up into three different ideas. You have the electrical side of the heart, which is pacemakers, what Dr. McKinney specializes in and Dr. Zhao specializes in. You have the plumbing, which is your arteries and your veins, and you have the structural side, which is your valves and all that and all those structures in the heart, and your valves and your chambers and other structures. And so those are kind of your three main topics. So we're going to focus today on the electrical side of the heart, and it's just like your TV. When you plug in your TV, you have an electrical system that goes. Your heart is the exact same way. It has a beginning, it has an end, and it has a circuit that kind of makes this thing beat. And so it's kind of weird to think about your heart and your body as a TV or an electrical device, but it's amazing, and that's exactly how it works. And so we're going to kind of show you that as we walk through. And so normal heart rates, a resting heart rate is between about 60 and 100 beats per minute. So you can go slower than that, which we call bradycardia, and you can go faster than that, which we call tachycardia. And those different scenarios, bradycardia and tachycardia, is why you get pacemakers and defibrillators. It's why you go and see Dr. McKinney. It's why you go to these doctors oftentimes, because your heart rate is out of control. So this doesn't mean you're having a heart attack. That's different. That's more on the plumbing side. This is more. This is a little slightly different, but it can also be fatal in some levels. That's why you get these different devices. There's two reasons why you get a pacemaker. Two main reasons that we kind of group in why you get a pacemaker. Because there's two structures in your heart. Well, we'll focus on the two structures that kind of can result in getting a pacemaker. The first one is called your sinus node, and it's right in the top right atrium of your heart, the top of your heart. I'm actually going to show you a little video here so you can kind of get a better idea of what this looks like. Here we go. All right, so this is kind of your heart here. looking at it on the left side of the screen is actually the right side of the heart. So this would be if I was the patient. So this is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side. And as you can see up on the top here, this is your sinus node, and this is what starts your heart beating. This is your natural pacemaker. Without this natural pacemaker, your heart wouldn't start. And so this is why, if we have a problem with our natural pacemaker, then this is why you need an artificial pacemaker. If obviously that makes sense. And so this is what controls the rate of your heart. So if your sinus node is messed up, sometimes it can go too fast. We call that sinus tachycardia. Sometimes it can go too slow. We call that sinus bradycardia. Either way, in any of these issues, you can kind of see on the left side of the screen is the issue heart. On the right side is the normal sinus rhythm. And it's nice because you can see the difference. See how fast this one's going over here? It's a little erratic. And so when your heart gets erratic like that, when it gets out of sync of where it's supposed to be, you doesn't pump blood as efficiently. And that's what we want. It's all about efficiency when we talk about the heart. Just because it's beating doesn't mean it's beating as efficiently as we'd like. The other reason, the other cause for bradycardia, the other reason for a pacemaker is a problem with your AV node. And your AV node is the communication point between the top of your heart and the bottom of your heart. If you have a break in that communication, you can also lose your heart rate. And this one can be even more severe sometimes. This one can result in no heart rhythm at all often. The top of your heart might be working fine, but the bottom might have issues. So I'm going to show you a little video on this as well to kind of get you an idea of what it's supposed to look like and what it looks like when you have this issue. So again, the AV node you're going to notice they're going to focus on is right in the middle of your heart. So usually things in the middle are very important. They're usually central points of the heart. So the middle little AV node, as you can see, it's showing our picture here. When this AV node has issues, you'll see the heart kind of slow, and it doesn't have as good of contractions and beating. And when that happens, we're just not getting that blood flow. And we don't get that blood flow, we don't get oxygen to our body where we need it to be. So you're going to notice that as a theme as we go along. Usually, when you're dealing with pacemakers, oftentimes it's about efficiency. It's about how can I make my heart beat as well as it can. So when we see those two problems, we oftentimes will look for pacemakers. And the big key in this situation is the patient, you guys need to be having symptoms in order to get this. So you might have a slow heart rate. I think Lance Armstrong had a resting heart rate of about 40. So like I said, normal heart rate 60 to 100. But just because his heart rate's in the 40s doesn't mean it's bad. He just has a very efficient heart. And so, athletes you oftentimes will see have heart rates in the 40s and 50s. Nick over here probably has a heart rate in the 70s, right?
No.
So what we like to see though is that heart rate working for you. So if you come in and you're feeling lethargic and you have a slow heart rate, the doctor will probably talk to you about a pacemaker option if we see some continual events like that. So I'm gonna keep walking through here. Oops, sorry. On this thing. So now that you get a pacemaker, I kind of want to show you guys how it works because they can be a little confusing at times. So there's kind of two main functions that a pacemaker does, and then the newer devices have a storing function where they store episodes as well to help us diagnose atrial fibrillation and other arrhythmias. So the two main things are sensing. They sense the patient. They sense your own heart rate. And pacing. If you don't have a heart rate like we want, it'll deliver a slight impulse and allow your heart to beat. So I'm gonna do a little video. You can see on the top screen is actually a normal heart rate. This is a heart rate that looks perfect, no problems. So the device just watches a heart rate like this. You see on the bottom, slightly different. This is actually a heart rate where you're having problems with that communication function. So the pacemaker is actually pacing in the bottom of your heart, creates this large impulse, but it keeps your heart beating at a very efficient level. So that's kind of the little things that the pacemakers do. I'm going to show you. It's going to show you kind of like slightly what the implant looks like, which we'll get into in a second, and also give you a little view of these little guys. So this is a pacemaker right here. When you get these pacemakers, actually, a lot of people think they're implanted in your heart, and we're probably not far off from that, actually, leadless pacemakers. But at this point, the wires are actually implanted in your heart through your venous system, and the pacemaker is actually connected up in your chest cavity. And those wires is how the device senses and paces in your heart. It creates a little circuit down your heart. You can kind of see how it works, how it's kind of making this heart pace in this in this scenario. So what we've learned is the pacemaker can sense signals in your heart, it kind of listens for your heartbeat, and it can also pace or deliver energy to make your heart beat if it's not beating as efficiently as the doctor would like, or if you're feeling bad. The cool part about the newest devices is that they're so programmable. You can change a lot of options. So if you come in one day and you're not feeling good, you felt good 2 weeks ago, but now you're not feeling good, we can make a couple adjustments on that, and sometimes we can actually make you feel a little better just immediately in the office with our programmer. You don't have to go through another procedure or anything like that. So it's really, really cool how these things are easily changed in the office setting. All right, and then the last thing, which is, I think to me, is the future of the device world, because the actual implants now are so good, these doctors have gotten so good that they're able to put these wires in precise spots where the pacing and the sensing is not as big a problem as it used to be. So now the storing of information and really the ability to analyze your heartbeat is the future of really where these things can go, and how Dr. McKinney and Dr. Zhao use these devices. They store information to precise beats, so you can really map it out to like the minute or the second you were feeling these episodes. So it's really a benefit to the patients and these doctors who are trying to diagnose certain arrhythmias, and we'll see some more on that when we get into the programmer, but it's really cool, the storing features that are now available on these devices. So that's pacemakers. So now we're going to move into defibrillators, or ICDs, which is an implantable cardiac defibrillator. And what I want to talk about is two rhythms that really result in a defibrillator. There's a lot of other reasons you can get defibrillators now based on settings, but there's two rhythms that we're really going to focus on, and it's ventricular tachycardia, or VT, and ventricular fibrillation. And both of these rhythms have a similar problem. The heart rate is going too fast. The bottom of your heart is going too fast. And by too fast, I mean that it's pacing so fast that it's kind of quivering. And I'm going to show a little video in a second. You're going to see how the regular heartbeat kind of contracts and the walls of your heart contract and they push blood out into your body, and how when the fibrillation is going, it's not pushing any blood to your body. It's almost like the heart is not moving at all, but it's actually the opposite. It's moving so fast that it's not efficient for your body. And so what happens is, you see on TV, they have the paddles and they shock the patients out of these rhythms. So this is actually inside your body, and it's able to do the exact same thing, which is very awesome, great technology, and allows patients to live a lot longer lives. I'm going to do a little video on both these rhythms right here. All right, so the first one is ventricular tachycardia. You see how fast the heart rate's going. You see the top of the heart is beating regularly. It's perfect. There's no problem with the top of the heart. It's the bottom of the heart that's having the problem, and that's where the issues arise. And a lot of things can cause this. If you have a history of a heart attack or anything like that, we call it ischemic issues. You might have scar in your heart, and this scar can cause the problems. There's also ablations that Dr. McKinney and Dr. Zhao do for these as well. That would be a whole nother talk. And as you can see, the difference between the regular sinus rhythm and the ventricular tachycardia, it's very obvious why your heart is not efficient in this stage, and it can be detrimental to some people. So if you recall what that looks like, I'm just going to show you this because it's interesting to see the difference in speed of ventricular fibrillation and ventricular tachycardia. At least in ventricular tachycardia, you had a little bit of a rhythm. This is very erratic. So you see how erratic it is, these signals with the ventricular tachycardia. At least you had some sort of synchrony, some sort of beating. In ventricular fibrillation, your heart is barely beating at this point. And this is the last stage. Like, this is the stage, if you don't do anything about it, your heart will go asystole, will go flatline on you. So this is why the defibrillator is implanted. Oftentimes patients will say they feel a lightheadedness or a dizziness right before a shock, and it's because their heart is not beating efficiently at all. So I just want to show you those two rhythms just so y'all can see the heart and just kind of see what's happening in those scenarios. All right. So what we were talking about is sudden cardiac arrest. This is the actual problem why you get the device. You're getting it because you have a great chance of having sudden cardiac arrest. Whether that be you've already had some, I think before they came out with any of the any indications that we have now, you used to have 2 sudden cardiac arrest events, meaning you had to die pretty much twice in order to get a defibrillator. Now there's a lot more indications for these, a lot of symptoms that patients can exhibit that show us that this patient might have ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia in the future. So it's saved a lot of lives by what we call primary prevention, meaning we're going to prevent an episode from even happening. We don't need to see it before we put something in. So, but the 2 ways, sudden cardiac arrest is, say you can have CPR with sudden cardiac arrest, or you can have a shock, which is what the defibrillator kind of helps with, the shocking stuff. And so, just like we went through a pacemaker, defibrillator, very similar. There's a sensing side and a pacing. They're actually all defibrillators are also pacemakers. All pacemakers are not always defibrillators, but all defibrillators have a pacemaker feature. And the reason is because after you get that shock, sometimes you need a backup pulse to help your heart beat. And so we have a pacemaker designed in there to help with that. Also, we don't want patients to get shocked if they don't have to. That's a big key. There's a lot of studies out there that show that patients who get shocked, even if it's appropriate, tend to have higher mortality rates, tend to not do as well. Their quality of life is just not good. And oftentimes I think it's the stress that comes from this shock. It can kind of hurt that way. So what we try to do is we actually try to deliver a pacing impulse. So we try to deliver like the pacemaker does, but we try to deliver it so fast that it kind of stops the rhythm. So it kind of races past the rhythm and halts it right where it's at. And so that's what we try to do first before we deliver that shock. And I'll tell you what, this is shown to have great success. Sometimes patients will come in the office and they won't even know they had an event. We tell the patient, you had an event on Wednesday at 3:45. They're like, man, I felt great. I don't know what you're saying, but the device took care of the problem so quickly. And so these patients really enjoy the benefit of the ATP. But if that doesn't work, we will deliver the shock, like you see on the bottom. The fibrillation's coming, the crazy rhythm, and the shock resets your heart, resets all your cells, and begins your heart back again. So it's really cool. All right, so we're going to show, Nick's going to come over and help me show a little device implantation. So we kind of went through what an ICD was, what a pacemaker is. We're going to show you how we put one of these leads in with our little heart model. The first thing that will happen when you get an implant is that they'll put you under sedation. And so sometimes that's scary for people. But for a pacemaker or defibrillator, oftentimes, and even some of our EP or ablation cases, the patients will actually be awake slightly. We call it conscious sedation. And so the patients will be able to communicate with the doctor if necessary, if the doctor needs to talk to the patient. But oftentimes the patient won't really remember the procedure because they're in a twilight state. So after you get you get all of your sedation and you're ready to go and you got your cocktail of medication and you're in the procedure, the doctor will start the case. So, Doc, take care.
All right. So the first thing that he'll do is he'll make an incision in the chest here, and then form a little space in the fat layer right there called the pocket. And that's where he's going to put the device, either a defibrillator or a pacemaker. And then once he does that, he'll take a needle and he'll stick the needle here into a vein. And this is the vein right here. So he'll stick it out here into the subclavian vein. And once he has access to that, we'll take an introducer and place the introducer in there. And now he has access into the vein. It's got a little adapter so the blood can't come out. From there, he'll take the lead, and this is what's going to connect the heart to the pacemaker. And we'll slide the lead through the introducer and into the vein, and this vein is going to take it, this vein goes straight to the heart. So it goes in first, it's into the right atrium. Let's try and flop it down into the ventricle. Let's see.
Oh, it's so easy, isn't it?
You guys will get your chance later. You guys will get your chance later.
There it is.
Nice.
Got it. So now it's into the ventricle.
Can everybody
And-
see that? You don't see the lead?
Can everybody see it? It flop down into the ventricle here, and then he'll test it in a few different areas to make sure electrically it can pace at a low voltage, and it can sense the patient's heart appropriately. And once he gets it into the spot that he likes, he can either two different kind of leads. This kind of lead, it would screw right into the heart, and then take the pacemaker. And this is the battery, and plug it into the pacemaker. And screw that in, and then the pacemaker will sit in the pocket of the patient right there, and it can pace the patient's heart. So whenever a patient needs a battery change, that's really a pacemaker change. So the lead stays into the heart, it's already in the heart, and I'll take that out and hook up a new pacemaker, and that's the battery change. So the pacemakers can last, now our pacemakers have lasted for 13 years sometimes. Yeah. All's good?
It's good.
What kind of battery do they have?
Nice.
Yeah, that it's MnO2. I don't know what the actual
Yeah, so it's-
chemicals are in it.
So you have lithium on one side.
Lithium.
Yep. So it's kind of like your cell phone battery, except on steroids. So and people will often ask, why can't these be recharged like my cell phone? You know, it's lithium. Why can't it be recharged? Well, if you think about your cell phone, you have to recharge this thing every night, right? So, I mean, these things are dying in 16 hours. You know, like you barely get through a day with these things anymore. You don't want to have to do that with your heart. You know, you don't have to recharge your heart. So people are working on rechargeable batteries, but the battery would have to fill this room if it was going to make your heart. If it was going to last 10 years like these things do today. So it's very efficient. So you do have to go through a generator change oftentimes or battery change to get a new one, but it's worth it because the benefit that it gives you is great. And like Nick said, you get to keep that lead in there. So anyone who's been through a procedure knows that the few weeks after the procedure are the hardest because you can't really move your arm, stretch up, or lift because you don't want to pull that wire out of place. You need to let it heal, and so when you get a generator change, you don't have to worry about that. So just a couple little things that the batteries are great technology, and they're really improving year after year. So thanks, Doc. For that. So length of time of the procedure. So usually some doctors will do it in a half hour, depending on the anatomy of your heart. It can take up to an hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes 2.5 to 3, depending on what procedure we're doing. So it's kind of a wide range. Usually we'll know pretty comfortably when we get in the procedure how long this is going to take, based on the first couple maneuvers and positioning of the lead. So everything goes very well, and patients come out feeling great. So of course this is an AFib support group, so we got to talk about AFib a little bit, right? I mean, Dr. McKinney's sitting in the back. We got to hit on some AFib. So what we're going to talk about over the next few slides is not just atrial fibrillation, but how the device helps us with atrial fibrillation, how the device helps manage atrial fibrillation, which means we talked about how it listens to your heart, how it sees your heart, and this is the important part. We talked about the pacing, but really the listening and the seeing, just like in life, the listening and seeing is the most important part, right? If we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we're supposed to listen, just like the device. If the device has problems listening and seeing, there's issues everywhere. So if you can't see correctly or listen, you're going to pace at the wrong times or not pace at all, and you're going to miss these arrhythmias that Dr. McKinney needs us to see. So oftentimes when you have atrial fibrillation, you'll see this very chaotic rhythm here. We saw that original EKG where it had the nice little humps, looked very pretty. This one, not so pretty. So oftentimes if you have atrial fibrillation, you can get a pacemaker for that, and sometimes it's because here's some symptoms. We'll go with symptoms. So I'll do symptoms first, and then we'll do the pacemaker. So here's some symptoms that we often have for AF, and I'm sure you guys have gone over this, but I threw them in there just so you guys know. Just racing, pounding heart. You get erratic pulse. You feel worn out, you feel tired. These are just really oftentimes things that you see with AF. And the reason is because AF, when it makes your heart beat erratically like that, you're losing all the blood that normally gets pumped from the top of your heart. So when you're losing that blood that pumps from the top of your heart, can be up to about 20% of the output of your heart, you tend to not deliver enough oxygen to your body. Again, it's an efficiency problem. And so what happens is oftentimes you can get a pacemaker for that. You can get a pacemaker because you're having, what this is fast and slow rhythms. We call that tachybrady. So you have fast, tachy, slow, brady. And so you might get a pacemaker for that because sometimes this rhythm can cause ventricular tachycardia, which we saw is very dangerous. So instead of getting a defibrillator, a bigger battery with a little more hardware, you can just get a pacemaker, and that can actually fix your problem. Oftentimes, though, you'll get a pacemaker because your rhythm is going so fast when you're in atrial fibrillation. We saw how fast it looked on the screen. A lot of patients in here, when we were talking earlier, you guys said you don't really feel it, or sometimes you feel it. And the reason you feel it is because the bottom of your heart is trying to catch up with the top. And so it's trying to go as fast as the top of your heart. So if you think about it, the top of your heart is going like this. It's quivering over here. The bottom is doing good. But let's back to this. Sorry. But it's kind of a challenge. So when the bottom of your heart is beating regularly, it's great. But sometimes it'll try to catch up with that. So it's trying to catch real fast, and it's making you feel that rhythm. Sometimes it can make you pass out. Sometimes it can make you feel just worn out and tired. And so oftentimes doctors will prescribe medication. I know you guys have gone through medication, and I think the second half of the medication talk might be in 2 months. So we're going to continue to talk about medication because that's so important in regulating your heart rates and regulating atrial fibrillation. But it also might mean you need a pacemaker because if you put on too much medication and it drops your heart rate, then you might feel bad for that reason. So we got to balance this thing out. So you get a pacemaker to keep your heart rate up, to keep your heart rate above 60 beats per minute or 70 beats per minute, depending on what you need with that medication, if that makes sense. So you have the medication, keeps your heart rate regulated, but sometimes too low. You have the pacemaker keeping your heart rate up, regulated. So efficiency is the key. So that's what we're looking at. So the big question is, when I come in for a device check, I know a couple of you have devices, some of you do not, but if you come in to see us for a device check and then see Dr. McKinney, I'm just going to go over briefly what we're looking at. So I'm going to show you on our programmer kind of what we're going to see. Unsterile environment over here. So when you get a pacemaker, you come in for these interrogations, and the way we're set up at Dr. McKinney's office is really cool because the patient can oftentimes see the screen, can see what's going on, what we're seeing in their heart. As you see up on the top of the screen here, this is actually your heart rhythm. The top line is actually an EKG, just a basic where you put the little patches on your body, and like they do every time you go in and they look at your heart rate and see if you're in AFib, if you're not. We also can do that with our device, and so we can see that. But we also, because we have these wires inside the heart and we're sensing and we're pacing, we can actually see the signals inside your heart. And so what we're seeing when you see this A-sense sample is actually a wire in your atrium, in the top of your heart. So it's really cool. It's really precise. You see that atrial beat, every single one of them. And so what that means is when you go into atrial fibrillation, which I'll show you right here, you can often see under episodes, which is the main thing Dr. McKinney wants to see when you guys come in. Look at all these A's. So you see how many A's we got. You saw before, it was just, one A every 70 beats here. You got 70 beats per minute, so that's how fast you're going. So we got 70 beats every minute. So you can see what that looks like. And then when you go back and you look at this, you're actually getting 320 of these A's for every minute.
So he's looking at the blue line.
Oh yeah, sorry, the blue line. Sorry, you can't really see my little thing. There you go. So the blue line up here. See all these A's right here? You're actually having 320 of these every minute. That's very fast, and what that means is you're not getting any help from the top of your heart. And that's where Dr. McKinney and Dr. Zhao come in. And that's what they look for when you come in to see us. They look to see one very big number. And this usually is a lot of patients who have been coming for a long time want to know what this number is. And it's down here, it's called your mode switch or your ATAF burden right here, which means how often am I in these rhythms throughout the last 3 to 6 months, or maybe a couple weeks. So it's a very good indication if this number is getting higher then your AFib is getting a little bit worse. And so we need to either change our medications or look for a different strategy. So if you're not having a very high burden, oftentimes Dr. McKinney, Dr. Jow will just say, hey, we just want to watch you. We want to see how you're doing. Are you feeling good? That's awesome. You see this number creep up in the 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50%, there might be something that needs to be done. And so this is why when you come in, we always check these devices, because we want to know where that burden is. Are you being burdened by AF, or are you being freed from AF? And so oftentimes you'll get an ablation. You'll have a device, and Dr. McKinney will go in and do an ablation. Dr. Zhao will go in and do an ablation, and you'll come back, and your burden will be awesome. You'll be like, what is that thing at, 0? Exactly, that's exactly what we want to see. And so it's actually, so it's really an interesting thing for the patients to be able to interact in their clinics, because they can actually see these programmers, see these screens. And I just wanted to kind of show you guys what you're looking at. Show you another little rhythm as well. It's another example of that atrial fibrillation, that really fast rhythm. So it's really cool how these programmers can help us diagnose what the pacemaker is seeing, and can kind of see how that's working in your body. So. So that's great. So, that's all good. What does that mean? What is, so, oh.
You start off.
Back in the beginning, I guess. So what does that mean? So we see how the pacemaker, we've seen what the pacemakers do. Sorry, get back in my, sorry, Sharon.
What you got? Get back.
So we got to see what so we've seen how the pacemakers work. We've seen why the pacemakers are implanted. We've seen how defibrillators work. We've seen how defibrillators are implanted. We've seen an implant. We've seen how the programmer, how when we're when you guys come into the room, how we can see from visit to visit how your heart's doing based on how the device is listening and sensing your heart rhythm. But how does that help us? What does that do? So first of all, I talked about the ATAF burden. I talked about how that shows us, are you at a risk for stroke? Do we need to put you on different medications? I know a lot of you guys are on blood thinners, Coumadin, Xarelto. I'm sure you don't like to hear those words sometimes, but they're so important to your heart, because when you're in these rhythms and you're going in and out of these rhythms, and we're diagnosing that through the device, it can really help us to determine if you need to be on more medications or more blood thinners or not. And also, it allows Dr. McKinney and Dr. Zhao to schedule procedures for you, because we're seeing what's going on in that heart. We can see what rhythm you're going into, so we can see, do we need to schedule a pulmonary vein isolation? Well, they'll go in a whole nother talk about how we're gonna stop this AFib in the future. Do we need to schedule SVT? Do you have another type of rhythm? Do you have atrial flutter? So it really just helps these doctors determine, how can I help this patient further? How can I make this patient's life fuller and more broad as they continue on in life? And the last thing, it shows us the results. So you guys go in for these procedures, we want to see the results. Dr. McKee, Dr. Zhao, they want to make sure the procedures that they're doing are helping you guys. They want to make sure that when you come back to clinic, you're having benefit from these procedures. Because if not, the changes need to be made. And medicine's awesome because it's so evolving every day. And you guys get to be in the center of it right now, which is an awesome time, because it's cool just to see. I mean, I was showing people earlier, but this is one of our old devices, probably 3 or 4 years old, and as you can see, they get smaller and smaller every year. I mean, you see our pacemakers, this is a couple years old compared to what we currently put in right now. So the technology just changes so rapidly, and it's kind of a great time to be with doctors like this who are on the cutting edge of technology. So I really appreciate you guys, and if you guys have any questions, if you wrote down anything, I'd love to answer that. Dr. McKinney, do you guys answer any questions as well, if they have?
Jen and I have come up.
Okay, cool.
You did a great job.
Awesome.
I like your props.
What?
I love your props.
And if anyone wants to come up and implant afterwards, feel free. Try to beat Nick's. Model is open.
And Nick found out this is not always so easy to get that nod. So what do you think can go wrong in a pacemaker implant?
Here's a vein or artery.
Okay, so we got a needle. Actually, Dr. Zhao does this, I don't.
You better than me.
So you're sticking a needle into that vein. What's right around that vein is the lung. And the lung's a big balloon. And so if that needle doesn't go right in and it hits the lung deflates, just like you pop a balloon. Then you need a chest tube. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. There's another structure that runs behind that vein. It's called the subclavian artery. So sometimes that could be punctured and you can get bleeding. And then sometimes, very rarely, this lead, which Nick so skillfully maneuvered into the tip of the heart there is very thin, and even a very careful implanter can have that lead perforate or punch a hole, in which case sometimes it has to be surgically repaired. Now, these don't happen often. They happen very rarely, but you need to know everything that, that's part of the consent process, is to know what's the worst thing that can happen. So I'm just going to tell you a couple of those things. And I guess finally, although there's many weird complications, you're going through the skin, and bacteria from the skin or from that pocket that Nick talked about can track along the lead and cause an infection. So those are the bad things that can happen. So this is a beautiful model that, if you've never seen it, actually you can come put your hands on it and play with the lead and, manipulate it. In some patients, the subclavian vein is stenosed or clogged off, and you can't get the lead through here, and you have to try other alternative approaches. So I guess these guys did a great job. I love the quality of the slides. But the one question we get asked a lot, and Jen and I get asked a lot, is, well, if I have AFib, why just can't you put a pacemaker in? Why won't a pacemaker make my AFib better? Okay? Well, let's think about it. The pacemaker, like the analogy was, you've got two ears and one mouth. Well, the mouth is the pacing, the ears are the sensing amplifier. It's what a pacemaker does is it looks for things. It's got a sensing amplifier. So there's an antenna here, and if it sees a normal heartbeat, it resets. It doesn't do anything. So when your heart rate is above, let's say the pacemaker is set at a rate of 60. If your heart's gone 70, what is the pacemaker doing? It just keeps listening. It just keeps listening. It doesn't do anything. Okay? So pacemakers in and of themselves don't do anything to fix your AFib. But let's say, for example, you've got AFib and your doctor gives you amiodarone, for example. Many of you have taken amiodarone. And amiodarone slows your heart rate. And all of a sudden your heart rate is 35 and you're walking around like this. Well, what a pacemaker does is it props the heart rate up so that you can then continue the medication. Okay? So it props the heart rate up. But it doesn't do anything to fix the AFib. The medicine is doing that. The pacemaker just allows you to keep using the medicine. Okay? And Mike showed a slide earlier where you had the fast heart rate and then there was no beat. We had a lady we cardioverted yesterday morning, and when she cardioverted, there was no heartbeat for about 40 seconds. The lab got very upset about that. And we had to give some medicines to prop the heart rate up. But you got to remember, when you're in AFib, your heart's clock is suppressed. And sometimes when you break out of AFib, there's no heartbeat. That's why many patients will say, well, I get these swooning spells where they're going into AFib and they're breaking with a slow heart rate. So the purpose of the pacemaker is generally to help us use medicines we couldn't use before. A much more unusual indication for a pacemaker is sometimes patients' heart rates are so fast and we don't think that they can tolerate any procedure. What we'll do is we'll have Dr. Zhao put the pacemaker in, and then that little nerve that Mike showed will come back through the leg and cauterize that nerve, so the upper chamber can quiver all it wants. It can try to drive the bottom chamber, but the switch is turned off, and then the pacemaker props the heart rate. So that's how we use pacemakers in atrial fibrillation. A few years ago, they did develop an atrial defibrillator, but it was not popular because patients were getting popped in the chest all the time when they were in AFib, and they didn't like it. So that has been, that area is still being investigated. There's some centers that are actively working on atrial defibrillators. And one of the things Mike and Nick didn't go over is that there's now a system where you don't even need to do the implant through the top. It's called the leadless pacemaker. Have you ever heard about those? They're now becoming available. The leadless pacemaker is simply just, it's you go in through the leg vein and through a big plastic tube called a sheath, It's basically just kind of torqued into the heart muscle itself, and there's no lead. The leadless pacemaker. So these are how items are how pacemakers help us with AFib. One of the biggest things they do is when we go, they do all the work, and they hand me this piece of paper, and he showed you an example of what I'm really looking for is I want to see one number. I only want to see one number. What's the percentage of time you're in AFib? And it's surprising to many patients when they sit across from you and you say, oh, you had an episode of AFib yesterday at 3 in the afternoon, and your heart rate was going fast, and they say, well, I didn't even know I had it. Why is that? Because in the support group, we've talked to you many times, a third, maybe more patients, at least 30% of patients don't even know they have these rhythms. So these little devices are not only pacemakers, they're electronic counters, very accurate electronic counters, and that's how you should think of them, and that's why we do this. Now, a big question that comes up is that, you know, nowadays we've got these home monitoring systems, and Sharon gets deluged with these questions because patients will say, well, how come you didn't call me when you saw that? Well, there's no human being when you have those home monitoring systems that's watching your heart. I mean, I hate to say it, you could die and nobody would even know about it, right? But that's the truth because the systems only collect the data for later presentation. There's no human being sitting across from that. That's important because we get asked those questions a huge number of times. Well, how come you didn't pick that up? Why didn't you call me about that? This is it's a collection system, but it's not an active home monitoring system. Okay, just so that'll be cleared up. So I think we'll stop and we'll entertain some questions.
Oh,
Yes, ma'am.
I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How long do the leads last?
That's a great question. So the leads are made of, in general, two types of substances. The older silicone and the more modern blends of polyurethane. And silicone leads are very, very durable, but they tend to be difficult to maneuver in the heart. So most of the companies have their own blend, their own mixture of polyurethane, but polyurethane tends to break down. So that's one of the problems with leaving leads in for long periods of time. If you're 20 years old, you face that lead being exposed to the stresses, the mechanical stresses, which you could probably model on a computer very easily. The mechanical stresses of that lead with the heart beating, you know, thousands of times, will eventually wear any lead down. So these leads do tend to break down. That's why lead extraction, which is one of Dr. Zhao's interests, he trained extensively in it. We work in collaboration with the surgeon. Lead extraction is a big item nowadays. We've got patients who sometimes have 3, 4, rarely more leads, and they clutter up the heart. We've got to get them out. So the question is, how long do they last? It differs by company. It differs by product. Some leads are on recall where we watch them for breakdown. On average, they can last for long periods of time. I would say anywhere from 10 to 20 years, sometimes shorter. Some of the leads break down right away. That's what's called a recall. And it's nothing worse than getting these guys say, I need to talk to you a second. You know, we've had a FDA advisory or an FDA recall they may want to explain. Then we have to bring you in more often and watch for signs that the device can break down. Most of the time, when let's say, for example, you're pacemaker dependent, your heart relies on that device. A lead breakdown in that situation can be fatal. Okay, so that's a great question. They're mechanical devices, they're made by human beings, and everything made by human beings breaks down. Okay, so we have to watch. That's one of the reasons why we interrogate. The device can test itself. It's called an integrity test. It does it automatically in the newer devices, and sometimes you can program an alarm on, and it'll tell you that. It's a great question. These leads do break down.
That's why the leadless device is becoming the hot topic. And
that's going to be the future,
yeah.
the leadless device. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that there's 2 leads, and the one that he put in there, that's to the lower?
So Nick took the easy road, and he only put the lead in the lower chamber. There's usually 2 leads. And the purpose of the two leads is to ensure coordination between the upper and lower chamber.
Okay, if one of them malfunctioned and you only have one working, which is the best one to have, upper or lower?
Good. Okay, so it depends on what your condition is,
Yep.
but in general, you want the lower chamber because that's the one that's actually pumping.
Okay,
So if the
lower
atrial
ones-
lead goes out, most of the time that can be watched. There's also devices that are called three-wire. Have you ever heard of a three-wire pacemaker or a cardiac resynchronizer or a CRT device? In patients who have very weak heart muscles, sometimes instead of the heart squeezing together in a coordinated way, like the clap of a hand to push blood out, sometimes one wall contracts and the other one is lazy, and it's like pushing against the other wall, and the heartbeat is inefficient. So if you put another lead on the back of the heart, you can make the hands clap together. That's called a resynchronizing device.
Okay.
Or
one-
resynchronize it.
One more question.
Mm-hmm.
If you have mitral valve prolapse and all these other heart conditions, how does all that come together?
Mitral valve prolapse most of the time has nothing to do.
It doesn't
With this.
affect it whatsoever?
No, the majority of patients get pacemakers because the clock is bad. And what's the most reason the clock goes bad? That we get older and we start forming scar tissue in the area around the clock. So the heart's clock starts to slow down, or the heart's relay station goes bad. Again, most of the time that's a consequence of aging. Okay, as we get older, these things tend to happen. But what's another common cause is that we give you drugs that do the same thing. Some of the medicines we use to control the heartbeat slow the heart rate down. So we trade one problem for another a lot of times. But the mitral valve prolapse, the mitral valve, which is not depicted well here. Okay, so if you envision a valve closing every time the heart beats, mitral valve prolapse is extra tissue, so instead of closing and stopping that blood from going back, mitral prolapse is the heart valve closes, then it buckles open, and the blood goes backward. But that doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with the pacemaker defibrillator. Any other questions? Yes, sir. I'll come back there.
I found out tonight I have bradycardia.
So bradycardia is slow heart rate.
Right. Mine's usually between 50 and 55. How concerned should I be?
Okay, so that's a great question. I have bradycardia either because my heart's clock is slow or because I'm on medicines that are slowing me down, either way, or my thyroid's bad, or any number of different reasons. My heart is slow. At what level does the doctor decide to put a pacemaker in? That's a real judgment call. In some patients, it could be a heart rate of 45. In some patients, it could be a heart rate of 50. In some patients, it could be a heart rate of 38. You'll know because you ask a couple of questions. One is, have you had blackout spells? Are you having near blackout spells? But a more subtle question is, are you as sharp as you were a few months ago? Is your mind cloudy? Can you go up a flight of stairs with the same get up and go? There's lots of little subtle questions we ask to know when to put a pacemaker in. And everybody has their own threshold. Now, obviously, if you're blacking out, the decision's easy. But many patients really, because this is many times gradual, they'll just feel blasé. They just feel tired. They're worn out. And when they try to go walk across the hospital, they're winded. They're winded because they can't get their heart rate up. So the decision to put it in really is individualized to everybody. There's no absolute number. The guidelines basically say if you have persistent heart rates in the 40 range, you get a pacemaker. But in many patients, it's a higher number. So that's a very individualized decision. Doctors have swung from putting too many in to now maybe not putting in as many. You know that every device now in the state of Louisiana is audited. Medicare audits every implant because for a few years, some doctors were putting them in so indiscriminately that, not out of greed necessarily, but because of poor training about when to put them in, that they now audit all of them. So every device that's put in now, the state of Louisiana audits. There's a federal review process on it, which is good.
What are signs of wear and tear on the batteries?
The wear and tear in the battery? Well, it's like any battery in like in your cell phone. Eventually, it will wear down. These are not rechargeable batteries,
All right.
but eventually they will wear down depending on how much of the device's function is used.
Yeah.
So if it's pacing a lot, it's going to wear down quicker.
It shows,
Okay, so you said the newer ones have a longer lifespan. So
So
when
the
you say
battery.
a newer
Yeah.
one,
The newer ones last longer.
okay, a newer one from 2014 on or for 2010 on? Because I
Well,
have.
every year they extend the battery life out a little bit.
Okay.
Not only by improvements in batteries, but they've worked, these engineers from Georgia Tech are so bright, they reduce the current drain. For every function the device does, they've reduced the current drain. So every year, the battery life kind of inches up a little bit.
but you see it every time they integrate your device.
Tells us how much.
It tells you the
green
battery,
bar tells you it's good.
the life.
Okay,
That's what he's looking for, that's what Mike's looking
Yeah.
for in the.
okay, gotcha.
Good question.
That's a great question. A lot of good questions. So this device can tell you a lot, and in the future, what will happen is they're also working on, by looking at the way the heartbeats vary, it tells you information about your physiology. For example, these devices are actually being used now to try to predict who's going to have cardiac arrest, for example. There's a lot of special things there's a lot of hidden information in those heartbeats that are being milked, for example. So we use them primarily as counters and to prop up the heart rate right now. But there's other. Now they can't track where you are. Not yet. But you can envision in the future that a defibrillator, for example, might activate an alarm to someone's loved one that their device went off. Let's say you live at home. Wouldn't it be nice if your parent, your brother, whoever lives alone and the device went off? Well, how do you know they're okay? So you're going to see sort of that kind of thing being developed also.
Okay.
These guys are so smart. I mean, they keep thinking of new things to do.
A question.
We're lucky. We get to benefit from them.
You mentioned this about cardiac arrest and everything. Okay, my question just went out the window.
That's okay.
Okay. If you get monitored once every 6 months in the office and you don't have a home monitor at home to monitor, how are they able to tell when you have the heart attack if you don't have the monitor at home and you only visit the one every 6 months?
A pacemaker cannot. Let's make sure our terminology is okay.
Yeah.
We use the term heart attack in a different way than the public uses the term heart attack. We use the term heart attack to mean one of the heart arteries that runs on the outer surface of the heart closes off and part of the heart muscle dies. Contrast that to having a cardiac arrest. That's an electrical thing, okay? If you have damage to your heart muscle, you're more prone to a cardiac arrest, but not all cardiac arrests are due to a heart attack. A heart attack is when plaque buildup is in the vessel and the vessel chokes off and the heart muscle is deprived of blood. Usually you get intense chest pain with that. These devices can't tell when you have a heart attack, but Mike has an example, I'm pretty sure, where a patient's gone into ventricular fibrillation, and what the device does, it says, oh, you told me that if my heart rate goes above 180, that's bad. So it's looking every second at the heartbeat, and what it does, if you were to go into this rapid, dangerous rhythm we call ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation, it's looking, and it says, oh, I see something, and it watches, and it counts, and it watches, and when it meets its preset criteria, it'll say, uh-oh, you're dying. So what it does is it tells a circuit in the device to charge up a big capacitor. A big capacitor is built into that device. I think they may have a cutaway if not. That capacitor then discharges an electrical punch to your heart, and it resets it.
And that's when you would actually be coming to or something?
That's when you would come to. So most patients who go into this dangerous rhythm, they start feeling dizzy, they clutch, they fall. All they may remember is going out, and then they remember waking up. Okay? You know a family member that's happened to?
Me twice in one day.
Can you show an example of a...
Yeah,
of
let's-
a,
Let me do it real quick. I got it.
so we can show you what that looks like internally. And one thing these things do is they count very well. They're really good counters. Now, sometimes patients will come to us and they'll call Sharon and they'll say, something happened to me last night. I was sleeping and I felt my device go off. And then we interrogate the device and the rhythm's normal. And what do you think happened? We have a name for that. Anybody know the lingo?
Malfunction. Malfunction?
Oh.
No, it's called a phantom shock, because sometimes when you're falling off to sleep, you get this kind of startle reaction. It's not really an AICD shock. When in doubt, call and let us look at it. These guys are hovering around here all the time. They love to come in.
There you go.
So he's going to show you what this looks like. Now look at the bottom. There's 2 layers of electrograms. Mike, you want to take me through it?
Yeah, so as we were looking at last time, we saw, if you looked at the AFib, remember the top line had a lot of signal. It was 320 beats per every minute. When you're having ventricular fibrillation, it's the complete opposite. The bot, as you see the top, is just going along regular, no problem, just ticking along. The bottom right here is where we're having the issue. And as you can see right here, down here at the bottom, 333 beats per minute. What did we say a normal heart rate was? 60 to 100, right? 333 is a lot of beats per minute. And what that means is, as you can see, it's going so fast that your heart is just barely quivering, and you're not getting any oxygen to your body. You'll pass out. And what happens is the device Dr. McKinney was telling you, it has these capacitors. This little bottom line right here is the capacitor charging. It charges up all this energy, and then it delivers a shock. And the shock brings you back to normal rhythm right here. Really cool.
Had the device not been in, that patient would have died. That's why defibrillators have reduced, if you appropriately implant them, they reduce the sudden death risk. But what a defibrillator can't repair your heart muscle. If you've got a weak heart muscle, bad things can happen because your heart muscle can get so weak it just can't pump blood. So it's not a device of immortality. But in those prone to this, that patient likely would have died had the device not intervened and stopped it. Let me give you a little historical accord. When we did the first defibrillator, you might not even know this. This was in New Orleans. The first one was done at Johns Hopkins. And actually, they dropped it on the floor. The first defibrillator was dropped on the floor. And they had to go pick it up and re-sterilize it. But in New Orleans, the first person to get a defibrillator was, before I went to Wisconsin for my training, I trained at Ochsner, was a NASA engineer who worked at the Michoud Space Center, and he had 2 heart attacks and had a very weak heart muscle, and he collapsed several times, and his fellow engineers actually built their own version of an external defibrillator. And so when he'd pass out at work, they would see in the movies, the paramedics put the paddles, this is an entirely true story, they would shock his heart. And they defibrillated him about a dozen times before this device became available, and he got the first implant at Oxford. So this thing was bulky, it was about the size of this, and so his friends at night would take it home, and fortunately it never happened while his wife had to do it, but they would resuscitate him in the field.
Man.
And he lived about 10 years after that.
That's awesome.
So what we try to do is tell you that a pacemaker is there primarily to prop the heart rate up during slow heart rates. A defibrillator is there to treat the rapid heartbeat. A defibrillator has a pacemaker built into it, and how we use it in AFib. Okay? So with that introduction, you may want to milk his mind a little bit when you see him and tell him to go through all the steps, and you can make him work a little bit for his money. When you see him, you say, "What?" I mean, you look at the device and say, "What is that? What is that doing?" You can learn a lot just by asking him some questions. And
no, we like it. It's good.
He likes folks to get involved with that.
Definitely.
One other question that people ask us a lot is about the MRI compatibility. Anybody have any questions about these? Because the old devices, you couldn't use a magnetic resonance scanner. Why was that, Mike?
So there's a couple reasons. The main one is that they're worried that that magnetic energy would heat the tip of these wires, and just like Dr. McKinney does when he goes in to fix your heart, when the wires would get hot, they would burn your heart muscle and kill that tissue, which is what Dr. McKinney will do on purpose in your heart if it needs to happen, but we don't want it to happen when it's not supposed to happen. So especially if you're pacemaker dependent, like he was telling you before. If that heart, just like when the battery goes out on your device, if you burn that muscle where that wire's at, it can no longer make your heart beat because that muscle's now died. So that's one of the biggest reasons. There's also the metals inside, but really it's the overheating of the tips of the leads that really scare people away from MRIs. So.
And now most of the devices are becoming more MRI compatible. Another question, famous question asked to me was from a national security advisor guy who a few years ago asked me, can a pacemaker or a defibrillator be hacked?
Oh, that's a good one then.
Yes.
And the answer is yes, they can be. But you have to be pretty diabolical to do that. I mean, you could, when Dick Cheney got his defibrillator, y'all know who Dick Cheney is, the vice president? So when Dick Cheney got his defibrillator before he actually got his transplant, they were worried that somebody might try to kill him, and there was a lot of people who wanted to kill him. So they would travel around with the rep and be able, because you could technically take that wand, or now even from across the room.
Yeah, you gotta be pretty close, but
You gotta be pretty close.
Yeah.
You could
About 10
technically
feet.
take that device and be close to somebody, and you could program that device to go as fast as it could and or not treat afterward.
Yeah.
There are ways you could technically hurt somebody with these things. I'm not aware of that ever happening in the real world, but this guy was such a paranoid,
yeah.
national security guy, he was, he asked that question. So I thought he was crazy. But then I later found out with some phone calls to engineers, because he made me call him, that yes, it technically could be hacked.
Yeah.
You can't use it to track your spouse going other places.
I must have missed this.
Yes.
Can you have an MRI if you have a defibrillator?
So that's what we said. So the newer devices that are coming out now, you can't have an MRI. So the older ones, it depends on which device you have. You can actually call in to see if it's MRI compatible. And I would say most devices in the next 5 to 10 years will all be, and the new ones will all be MRI compatible. But everyone's working on that. So.
But that's the leads. The leads are the things that determine whether or not you're MRI compatible.
It's actually the whole system.
Okay.
The new pacemakers, actually, they utilize a system, and that's how they can make it from not heating up the heart. Also, pacemakers, we didn't get into this, but pacemakers respond to magnets. Also, defibrillators respond to magnets in different ways. Actually, pacemakers will increase the heart rate when they're affected by a magnet, when a magnet is placed over the device. So that's also an issue. You worry about the speed of the heart rate in the MRI as well. So, but the newer devices all have magnet modes for MRIs, and they also, just the way that they're created, the circuit that they're created on helps to limit the heating of the tip. So, good questions though. Yeah.
So what happens if someone has an older defibrillator?
And they get an MRI?
Needs an MRI?
That's good. Great question. So there is a couple sites in the country and actually locally that will do MRIs, because they're starting to realize that even some older devices are okay in an MRI. They just monitor it very closely. There's also a lot of other things you can do as not an MRI, like other like a CT scan, like a lot of other things that can help you, with other problems. But there is places that will do MRIs on devices, but
The majority of patients
Yeah.
wind up getting a CT
Yeah.
rather than MRI.
definitely. Very good questions, though, for sure. Big topic right now.
Anybody else want to go over anything?
I have a question that somebody asked.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. This is not related to devices. So somebody wants this on tape.
Okay.
So they want you to talk about, if you're at home and go into AFib, what's the criteria before you go to the hospital? What do you do?
It varies by patient and by the severity of their heart disease, because everybody feels it differently. Remember one thing, it's very, 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 very unusual that AFib can kill you. Okay? Unlike ventricular fibrillation, which kills everybody if you stay in it, atrial fibrillation almost never results in sudden death. Now, that's not to say it won't make you feel very bad, and some patients are incapacitated by it. So in general, that recommendation depends on how well your doctor knows you. Some patients you can ride out for 12 hours, 24 hours, and come in the next day and get an EKG. Other patients, when they go into AFib, fluid builds up in their lungs, they go into what's called congestive heart failure, and that patient is better served by a trip to the emergency room. In general, the weaker your heart muscle, the more likely we're going to say wait only a brief period of time and then go to the emergency room. But that answer is individualized on everybody.
What about a sustained heart rate of what?
There's no magic number. It depends on how it's affecting you. So let's take the patient who has only minimal symptoms, is only mildly short of breath. Those patients, you might say, just wait till tomorrow, come into the office. Other patients we know who don't tolerate it very well, or some patients develop an extreme anxiety component when they go into it, where they're terrified of it. Those patients are probably better served by going to the emergency room and letting us treat it by intravenous medicine. So there's no absolute number, and we get asked that question a lot, but it differs for every patient, and it differs on how you perceive it. Some patients just cannot tolerate AFib, they have to go to the emergency room. And other patients, they can just get relaxed and get calm. Some of those patients will give one extra dose of medicine and will ride it out. In general, the experience of going to the emergency room is sometimes more traumatic than simply waiting it out till the next morning. That's why we try to individualize that. We don't say at this heart rate you have to come in, at this heart rate you don't. Jen and I probably would have different answers to that based on our own experiences. There's no right or wrong. It depends on how it's affecting you. That's the main thing. How is it affecting you? Now, if we know you have severe coronary artery disease, and we know you've got problems with your heart valve, you've got multiple other problems, and we know you, we may say, if you go into AFib, we think it's better for you, even though it's not bothering you a whole lot, to go into the emergency room. So it depends on so many different things that have to come together. So I'd like to give you a single answer, but the answer is different for every single person. It depends on what your doctor's knowledge is of your heart condition. It depends on what your tolerance to it is. We know how you react to it. There's a lot of things that make that decision.
Okay.
Well, we want to thank our St. Jude team. We want to, we'll let the fact that he went to Georgia Tech not deter us from our evaluation. Corrupted him in many ways. But we do appreciate him, and we do appreciate the model. So Dr. Zhao is a great implanter. I don't implant, thank God. He's got better hands than I do. But if you want to come up and play with the model and see how it's actually done, it's kind of fun to do that. If you want to let Mike go over the programmer with you and let you see what he's looking for, if you want to, anybody have a St. Jude device?
We have a couple of devices.
So-
I have a loop recorder.
Okay, so loop recorders, we love loop recorders.
Well,
We love loop recorder. I think everybody with AFib ought to have a loop recorder.
I've only had 2 incidents. One was over 2 years ago, but it was at a very stressful time, and I happened to be out of town. And so my doctor that I have here wasn't completely convinced that I really had the AFib, but it just might have been this one. But I did have to be cardioverted before they would even let me go.
Well, then you had AFib. Yeah.
So, right, well, but it, it went on for there's been 2, I just had another incident about a month ago. But it was before a big trip.
AFib is one of those strange conditions. Nothing is more neurally influenced from an arrhythmia standpoint than atrial fibrillation. For example, we've had patients undergo severe stress, have runs of AFib that last for a couple weeks. They get treated for a short period of time, and then don't have AFib for long, long periods of time. And then we've got patients who've had AFib that you seen it's very brittle, where almost anything sets them off, and then a severe stress comes up, like the death of a family member, and the AFib goes quiet.
Right.
So we've seen all sorts of combinations of this, and it's amazing. We've seen some, to me, I was kidding Sharon and Jen the other day about, a lot of patients who go on vacations, and all of a sudden the AFib flares up, and I say, well, maybe it's the stress of that. And they say, well, I'm looking forward to this, but good stress can trigger AFib just like bad stress can trigger AFib.
Well, it was but they gave me that option to have it inserted, basically just so that that he can see and monitor that once a month that you were talking about?
Well, it becomes important if we have to consider blood thinners,
Right.
because we have all these indications that tell us, doctor, you have to give the patient a blood thinner or you're considered malpractice if you don't force the patient to take the blood thinner.
Right.
And we have all these indications telling us when we should prescribe blood thinners. We have no information about when can we safely stop a blood thinner. It's one of the big gaps in medical knowledge. We don't know. But we do know that if you've had no AFib, it's safer to stop. Now, how do we know if you've had no AFib? It's to know with that mechanical device
Exactly.
implanted. So we're huge believers, Jen and I are huge believers in that. Almost every doctor I take care of for AFib, when given the option of putting a loop recorder in, they choose the loop recorder.
Yeah, it was no problem. I wasn't even put to sleep. But, you know, it's something that makes me feel more secure too, knowing, because when I did have it about a month ago, I could tell them exactly the right time. And right there in the office, they brought the machine.
Well, you know what these things are going to do is they're going to enable us to gather so much information, learn so much more about what triggers AFib in individual patients, and it's going to help us devise treatment strategies that are much better. We fly by the seat of our pants way too much. With those devices, it's going to help us a lot.
And it is an individual thing. You're so right about that.
It's totally, every patient has their own signature presentation of AFib. Yes, sir.
Let me ask you a question. Do blood thinners affect platelets?
That's a complicated question because, yes, they can affect platelet function, but that's not their primary function. If you have low platelets, though, you're more prone to bleed for any given level of blood thinner.
Mine's getting sky high.
The patients, many patients with coronary disease are on an antiplatelet drug. For example, Plavix is a common one. So that affects the platelets, and then you give them a blood thinner which affects the coagulation proteins, and you got a double whammy for bleeding. So if you're on the triple therapy, let's say you've had a stent, and you're on what I call the three evils. You got Plavix, aspirin, and you got something like Coumadin or Xarelto or Eliquis. Your risk of bleeding goes way up.
The only thing I don't want to take is aspirin. Put my platelets, last blood test, I had my platelets are getting up close to 50.
That's 48,000, so that's low. So your risk of bleeding goes up. Now what's going to happen is they're going to send you to a hematologist and they're going to try to investigate what's the cause of the low platelets. Some of the medicines can affect the platelet counts. It's an idiosyncratic reaction.
Well, I misunderstood my doctor. I thought he was assuming it would get too
He
high.
said they don't want to go any higher than 51.
I think the numbers you must have, because 50,000 of platelets is a very, very low number. That's a scary number. I mean, I wonder whether it's 450 or 550 or... I like to see the number on a sheet of paper, and I can tell
I
you.
do have that at home.
He said 38 is acceptable, but he said we don't like it to go any higher than 51. So
I
I
would
don't know
have
if he's
to-
talking platelets or what he's talking.
That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
Right.
That doesn't make sense to me.
I'm glad I asked the question.
Yeah. There's another big misconception about, a huge misconception to patients, it's very important, is that the antiplatelet drugs, like Plavix and Effiant and aspirin. Aspirin's an antiplatelet drugs. And even the primary care doctors have trouble with this. They don't provide protection against the thrombotic or the clot risk with AFib. They don't. So a lot of patients come in and they say, well, why? I ask them, why are you not on a real anticoagulant? They say, my doctor says I'm on Plavix and aspirin. There have been major studies that have looked at that. That does not protect you against stroke risk in AFib, unfortunately. And we've seen patients who, on the stroke unit, that was a false misconception of their doctors even. We had to go educate them. It's not acceptable.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody want to get on the? I love the props. Nothing else? Okay, so when is our next meeting? Sharon?
It'll be February, and we're actually look for the flyer, because we have two different topics already, and I don't know who's going to go first. And you can help yourself to anything back here.
Excellent. Thanks for coming to give us.
Please fill out our forms. Tell us how we did.
I think the more models, the better.